before I was a policeman for 25 years in Akron, I was a school teacher. So, and as a school teacher, I taught history. So I'm going to give you the history because that's what I'm comfortable with on CIT. Basically, you know, it began in Memphis, Tennessee, back in 1988 after a tragic event. A homeless person brandishing a sharp stick had a confrontation with the police, and in that confrontation, a policeman shot and killed this individual. The community was pretty upset over that, and through the years, and I think even now, sometimes you civilians don't understand how dangerous at times an edged weapon can be for police officers. You know, their body armor will stop a small caliber bullet, but body armor won't stop an edged weapon. And but anyhow, the community was upset with this tragic event, and the mayor of Memphis back then, you know, asked the police department, well, how much training have our officers had on dealing with people that are in mental health crisis? Because this man did have a mental illness. And the police department didn't really know. And so he said, well, let's study it. Find who has the best training out there in the country. And they did their homework, didn't find much of anything. Matter of fact, they were actually a little bit ahead of the curve with a couple of hours in the academy. So the Memphis Police Department, a couple of their shakers and movers and fairly educated officers formed a partnership with the University of Memphis and some psychologists and researchers, and through their efforts, they came up with their very own program. And it was 40 hours in length, and the thinking was, you know, these officers, they don't know much about mental illness, and gosh darn it, when people with a mental illness are in crisis, they call their families or whoever, or the society, they call the police to come in and sort of handle a person in the middle of their heart attack with no training hardly whatsoever. Didn't make much sense, but of course, police officers are out there 24/7. And so they came up with this program, and what they really believed was that, well, you know, we're going to ask some of our officers, right away they thought, because we're going to ask officers to handle more mental illness calls than they used to. We want special officers for special people. Not all officers are going to be well suited for this. And so what would we look for on the Memphis Police Department? Their strength was about 1,500. Of course, we wanted to be patrol officers. They're the first responders. So who would make the best candidates to become a CIT? And the T stands for Team Crisis Intervention Team Officers. Well, first of all, they thought, well, we don't want to alienate the other hardworking patrol officers by making these CIT officers that special. So let's make sure that the officers we pick to be CIT officers and wear a CIT pin handle regular calls just like the other patrol officers. But when it's determined, usually by the dispatcher, that this call is based in mental illness, let's funnel that to the CIT officers. Well, that was really a win-win. You picked volunteer officers, you looked at their backgrounds, you looked for emotional maturity, and you looked for leadership. So they're willing to handle these very difficult calls. Now, some of the other patrol officers who wanted nothing to do with this, they've always hated having to handle those kind of calls, and really may have done an okay job, maybe not. They didn't have to handle those calls anymore. A win-win. So they started this program, and lo and behold, you know, because it came out of a university, they did research, and what they found was, wow, you know, injuries not only have gone down significantly to people with a mental illness when we have to deal with them, but injuries have gone down significantly for our own officers. What's that all about? And then they also studied and found out that, our request and our use of force teams, our SWAT teams, has gone down 60%. What's that all about? And we don't have to call our hostage negotiators nearly as much as we used to. So to me, they had built a pretty darn good program. So here I am. I'll start to click here. Back here in Akron, had a nice career, moving along, become lieutenant, and I get moved into the training bureau as the director of training. I thought it was a pretty good fit for me because I'd been a school teacher, know how to do lesson plans and this and that. And things were just fine. I did have a couple incidents with people with mental illness in my career that ended very badly, and I carry that with me. But one day, the mental health system of my community, Summit County, Ohio, came to me as the director of training and basically said, Lieutenant, have you ever heard of CIT? I said, what's CIT stand for? Crisis Intervention Team. They told me about this program in Memphis, Tennessee that had recently got White House recognition because it was doing so well. I had never heard of it. They handed me a pamphlet on it. I looked at it. It looked very interesting. And then most cops, if they're any good, and I'm not saying I was good, but they're highly suspicious. That's what saved their necks at times, and they solve great crimes. Being highly suspicious is what it's at for a police officer. So even though that pamphlet looked pretty good, I said, it looks good, but I'd actually have to go through their course to make an educated opinion on it. And so the mental health system of my county said, well, we'll send you down to the course, the 40-hour course. I said, great. Now, what I thought was that my police department would pay for me to go, actually. And it was October of that year, 1999, and we had run out of funds for training. So I told the mental health system, listen, my department can't ante up for this because they've run out of funds. And the mental health system of my community said, well, don't worry about it, we'll pay your way. That meant a lot. That had never been done for anything on our department, where the community is going to pay your way to go down and look at a program. So I go down there, go through the program, become a believer, go through the whole 40 hours, come back to Akron, and I'm gung-ho. I want to start one here on our department. I tell my chief what I want to do, and he says, go ahead, Lieutenant. If you can get, it's the way he said, if you can get, I was wanting like 24 officers to go through the class. If you can get 24 officers to volunteer for this, you can put it on. He may have been a little skeptical. So I put it in our daily bulletin, a little brief, what CIT was all about, what it was. And if you thought you had the qualifications to be a CIT officer, you had to type me paper what those qualifications were, why you should be selected. In the meantime, I looked at your background, how many complaints you had, uses of force, and this and that, because that sometimes tells you about a person. And I made sure that they had at least a couple years of experience, because I didn't want some young rookie going out there and getting hurt, because this training is like no other you've ever seen. So I picked those first group of officers. They went through the 40-hour course, mostly put on by the mental health providers of Summit County, brought in. See, police officers don't have a realistic view, in my opinion, of mental illness. Why? Again, going back to, they get called when the person's in crisis. They don't get called when the person is not in crisis. So part of the CIT course is we bring in people that have a mental illness when they're having a good day. And we bring in their parents, because when we went out there when they were in crisis, the parents weren't having a good day either, or other loved ones. So we bring them in when they're having a good day. All roads, to me, in the CIT course for these officers is building empathy, giving them knowledge about why people won't take their medications. That's important to police officers. A whole different mindset once they learn that. Bringing in folks when they're having a good day. Parents and the person with telling their pretty down-to-earth and compassionate type stories of what they've gone through. Once those officers feel that empathy, then you can start teaching them de-escalation techniques without them thinking you're going to get somebody hurt here. You know, this is a bunch of malarkey. So this is the very first class that went through in May of 2000. I picked 20 out of 22 to 23 applicants. The 2 that I didn't pick really hadn't been on long enough, in my opinion. I do want to point out that this officer right here, who was of the officer level, now we're going back quite a ways, is now lieutenant in charge of training of Akron Police Department and their CIT coordinator. Several of those officers have made captain, so I think I did a pretty good job of picking people that were mature and had leadership abilities. But let's fast forward. All I was thinking about was my department. And that first class, they go out there, and within the first month, they make the news. You know, hey, I wouldn't have handled it this way. This may have saved me injury, da-da-da-da. But that news, I didn't realize it went actually throughout Ohio. So I'm sitting in my office one day, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's a female voice. And it says, "Is this Lieutenant Woody?" I said, "Well, yes, it is." It says, "Well, this is Eve Stratton from the Ohio Supreme Court." And I'm thinking, okay, who's playing a joke on me? Please, we'll do that. But it was her, and I remember her saying, "You know, Lieutenant Woody, you're on to something here." And she said, "You know, there's people in our jails and prisons that have mental illness that don't belong there. Not all of them." I had never given that any thought, really hadn't. And she said, "Do you think you could come down here to Columbus and talk to me about, you know, what you're doing up there?" And I was pretty sure that my chief would say, "Yes, you could go." So I told her that I would. Thank goodness he did. And obviously, with her immense help and her tenacity, she formed a great big group of all the shakers and movers down here. And it's like she likes to say, when she calls somebody up and they're not in and she leaves a message, they call her back. Wow! Is it for her? She'll get back to him. So she says, "You know, Lieutenant, we need to spread this throughout Ohio." So I was getting pretty close to having my 25 years on where I could retire. So I did, and started stomping around Ohio, and that's when I had a realization that, wow, most police departments are very small. CIT implementation might not work the same in these very small agencies, especially maybe the picking special officers for special people, because in a small community, it appears to me that all your patrol officers, especially with experience, need to go through the course. Otherwise, when that family calls for their loved one, there might not be a CIT officer available. So you need to tweak it a little bit. Now, again, her tenacity. After we got things going, things are moving along, more and more police departments in Ohio are getting CIT and running CIT programs. She goes, "Lieutenant Woody, you know, we ought to have a conference down here and call it a CIT National, maybe a CIT National type conference, and invite people from around the United States to see how much interest there is in the entire nation on CIT." And I didn't want to do it because I really thought if there was going to be one, it should start off in Memphis, Tennessee. And we waited 2 years, and for whatever reason, they couldn't get their act together. And so she's pretty persistent. She says, "We're going to do it." And so she had a BJA grant, and with their permission, she was allowed to give me half of it to have our own conference here in Columbus, Ohio, at their new convention center. We didn't advertise very well, and we really had hoped for 250 people to attend. We only charged $60 to come to it, and we thought we'd break even in. To our surprise, over 700 people showed up, 41 states, the District of Columbia, and also Canada showed up, who later complained that we called ourselves national, so we had to change the name to international. So we knew we were on to something, but at that course is where a lot of the shakers and movers from Memphis were there and some others, and we all got together and said, let's actually form a national CIT organization, which we did. You know, now it's CIT International. yearly conferences. At least 1,000 people attend them each year, and it's 3 days, 100 workshops. It's been very successful. I need to go back one, I think. Here's my color-coded map of where CIT county-wise is in Ohio today. Red means that at least 21% of your officers have gone through a CIT course. Obviously, we're there, and it's even a little better than that as I speak. So we really, really got it together. Of course, we're concentrating on these white counties and that over there, and we're working on them actually next month. So we're very robust with CIT in Ohio, probably lead the entire world with our implementation, more than any other state, but some are close. That just shows you by law enforcement agencies. Those in the red, which show up kind of pink here or orange, they have 100% of most of their officers that have gone through the course through the years. But they're usually rural communities, and they need to do that. Now this is my hope for the future. This PSA announcement comes from Virginia, Albemarle Police Department, and I'm waiting for some community in Ohio to do a similar PSA announcement. I want you to listen to this for a second.
I'm Sergeant Greg Davis with the Albemarle County Police Department. If you or a loved one is struggling with a mental health crisis, we encourage you to reach out for help. Region 10, UVA Health Systems, and the Albemarle County Police are here to help. Education, prevention, and early intervention are important to returning to a happy, productive life. For non-emergencies, call 972-1800 or an emergency call 911 and ask for a crisis intervention trained officer. Together, we can remove the stigma associated with mental illness. Please don't suffer in silence.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. It's coming from police. It's saying we have this program. What I really love about it is just in case that chief changes or that sheriff changes or a new mayor comes in, once that PSA is out there, it's going to be very hard for them to say, oh, you know what, let's just train all. Or, oh, you know what, we don't need to be 40 hours. We can do this in 2 days. Oh, no, let's put it in a police academy. Oh, my gosh. That puts their feet to the fire and makes things a whole lot better. So I want some of you in here to be thinking about this when you go back to your community and see if we can get one of them up and running. I'd love to have it with Akron Police Department, but I haven't been there for 15 years and things change at times. So.
Can you send that link to Carolyn so she can send it out to us? So as we're meeting, I know I meet a lot with my local police chiefs, that we could potentially play that for them, because I don't even know if they know that exists.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do it. I've got a couple of those. So speaking of our conferences, obviously the first one was in Ohio. We've been to Florida twice now, darn it, so they've got us beat a little bit now. Tennessee, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, Nevada, Connecticut, California, Illinois. We have them every year, and again, it's growing. We seem to be getting a lot of notice now from BJA and most of your federal agencies. They all tout CIT as if not the gold standard. They are saying evidence-based. I'm not sure, but it is a best practice, but it is the best thing going out there, and so we're moving right along. And I just want to close with the latest statistics on CIT in Ohio, because I keep the stats. And of course, we go back to May of 2000. In Ohio, we've had 650 CIT courses that have gone on throughout our state. Currently, 10,523 police officers have gone through the course, which is really about 43% of all our full-time police officers in Ohio. 647 of our 968 law enforcement agencies have sent officers to a CIT course. That's 67% of all of them. 78 Ohio County Sheriff's offices have sent officers. 62 State Highway Patrol officers have gone. 60 Ohio colleges and universities have trained 572 of their officers or security officers there. 251 probation officers and 83 parole officers have gone through the course. 271 hospital security officers have gone through. 138 parks rangers and 282 police dispatchers, and 30 officers from other states, including a couple from another country.
So I'm going to refer back to Mike's slides, first of all, because the maps that he showed focused primarily on the training statistics. So what I'm going to give you an update on is regarding the Ohio CIT strategic plan. In order to do that, we're going to talk about more than just training. But first, let me give a brief background to the Criminal Justice Coordinating Center of Excellence, which came into being a year after CIT in Ohio, so 2000 at Akron PD, and then 2001, the center was charged with the mission of disseminating best practices around jail diversion for people with mental illness. And clearly CIT is one of those programs. Our center is housed at Northeast Ohio Medical University, which you heard earlier. We're charged with promoting utilization of best practices or evidence-based practices when that's possible, but that's not always the case. So what's the best possible practice for diverting people with mental illness? We develop education and training materials at times, but more often than not, we try to promote that in the local communities so that the local communities are actually disseminating the education and training materials. One of the things that we spend probably the most time on is promoting cross-systems collaboration and information and data sharing. And we have a lot of partners with which we do that. So going back to CIT and those maps, which are really statistics regarding training, it's important to note that CIT is way more than training. Sam Cochran, who is one of the early founders of CIT, talks about the fact that it's a community partnership. So the strategic plan was really formed around all of the core elements that are part of creating a crisis intervention team program and not just the training. And there are 10 core elements that the strategic plan addressed. I'm going to highlight 4 of the strategies that we adopted here in Ohio as kind of our first point of attack. But I think it's helpful, first of all, to talk a little bit about what the core elements are related to CIT. So first and foremost, you have to have partnerships in the community. Obviously, law enforcement is a key partner, but the mental health system and the very people that we're talking about, the citizens and their family members and advocates, are the third prong of that partnership. A community really needs to embrace CIT. They need to take ownership of it. It can't just be that it's housed in a police department. It's got to be something that really begins to shift the culture in our community. And when the Department of Rehab and Corrections this past year decided to adopt CIT, that was really behind that decision, was that the culture needed to change. There should be policies and procedures. Law enforcement agencies should have policies regarding how they manage people with mental illness and how they're going to process them through the system and how they're going to engage with the mental health system. And on the flip side, the mental health system needs to have complementary policies and procedures that are adopted to go hand in hand. There are important roles and functions that need to take place and be in place in communities. Officers, dispatchers, and coordinators are key to that. And then, of course, there needs to be a curriculum behind the training that Mike really highlighted today. There should be a 40-hour training for your core components for CIT officers and their partners, but then there should also be companion training elements for EMS, fire, dispatch. Many communities have people with the courts involved in their training now, parole, probation, the judges themselves. So the community needs to decide who those partners are and what that training is going to look like. Mental health receiving facility, there's got to be some place to take individuals. When a law enforcement officer has an interaction in the community, jail can't be the only option if you're going to have a fully functioning CIT program. That's a struggle in Ohio, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Evaluation and research, the local community should decide what their goals are related to CIT and know how they're going to measure whether or not they're accomplishing those goals. So that comes down to data. It doesn't need to be necessarily really sophisticated data, but what is it you're trying to accomplish and how are you going to measure whether or not you're accomplishing that? And then ideally some participation over time in research regarding CIT to know if it's effective or not, locally and around the state. Recognition and honors of officers and their partners is really important, and we have more and more of that going on in Ohio, I'm happy to say. 5 years ago, we had a handful of programs doing recognition and honors, and now it's almost competitive. People are sending us notices all the time and wanting them to go out in the newsletter, to the distribution list, and that's a good thing, because that means the community's beginning to own it and to see it. And then lastly, CIT is one of the few programs I'm aware of that has in its core elements the responsibility for each of us to outreach, to encourage CIT utilization and growth in other communities. So in Ohio, we will sponsor mentors. So a seasoned CIT person, I think Chris Bowling's been one of them, haven't you, that we will ask to go to another community and mentor them as they start up, or maybe as they get over a hump that they're trying to work through. And that's an important part, that peer-to-peer networking. So those are the core elements, about as quickly as I can put them out there. This is another way that Ohio looks at those core elements. Paul Lilly, who's from Hancock County, developed this pyramid, this evolution pyramid for us some years ago. So we could look at CIT as kind of a building block and foundation. So starting at the top, needing to have a committed group of stakeholders at the local level, and then each building block on down creates a stronger foundation to the CIT program. And up until a few years ago, we only had 9 such layers to that pyramid, and then Paul very wisely suggested we add a 10th, which is the sustainability of the program. And that has meant a lot in Ohio, because 5 years ago we were having conversations with communities about, geez, if I go away, what will happen with the CIT program locally? Whereas today, it's pretty well understood and practiced that if a person is going to move on from that career, retire, go someplace else, they know that another person needs to be assigned. So we regularly now get notices of who the new CIT coordinator is going to be, because it's now more sustainable in Ohio. So a really critical component of that. And this tool has been very helpful to our local communities. So in 2015, it's only been 2.5 years, Justice Stratton. It's not been 5. It might feel like 5, but it's only been 2.5 years. We had a meeting in Columbus with key stakeholders to talk about where are we going with this. We had wonderful support from the Office of Criminal Justice Services, the Attorney General's Office, Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction, Supreme Court, but people wanted to know what direction are we taking, and can we all get on the same page and have a cohesive plan for moving forward. So we agreed to craft a strategic plan for Ohio based on where we knew we were at the time and where we knew we needed to go in terms of those core elements. And that plan was reviewed and revised, and we've been working on it now for a little over 2 years. These were the partners that were at that meeting. I think I just mentioned most of them. Oh, I didn't mention NAMI. And we came up with 4 key strategies. Now, there's a lot of detail to the plan, but I'm just going to report on the 4 key strategies and where we are today. The first one was that we needed to provide the necessary support to make sure that each program, each jurisdiction, which in Ohio is pretty well crafted by Adams Board areas, that they had both law enforcement and mental health coordinators. At that time, the lion's share of CIT coordinators were from the mental health side. And so really the underlying goal there was to get law enforcement to take more of a leadership role in CIT as opposed to just being training participants in CIT. To that end, it was interesting, as soon as we issued the strategic plan out to the CIT email list, we had about 9 law enforcement people put their hat in the ring to become co-coordinators for their local communities, which I thought was really amazing. Today, and that hasn't grown a whole lot recently, but we have at least 13 new law enforcement co-coordinators at the Adams Board level, which is incredible, and it's really creating a nice shift. This map shows the other thing that we did was hold 2, well, soon to be 2. We've held 1 CIT coordinators course to train coordinators on the core elements and what their role is in actually disseminating CIT around Ohio. So we held 1. We're holding another one in December, and in the greenish blue counties are the folks that completed the course, and in the gray counties are the counties that have coordinators signed up to complete the course in December. So once these are done, we will have had 22 law enforcement coordinators go through the CIT training course and about 20 mental health coordinators. That doesn't count the 13, 14 coordinators that went through CIT coordinator training through CIT International. So it's good coverage. It's a very good beginning, and we've got 15 people on the waiting list past December, so we're going to continue to do this because it's paying off. The second strategy was to make investments in the crisis response system. So you saw the, I think, sixth core element was mental health receiving facility. And I'm probably not the best person really to report on this particular strategy, and Dustin, in fact, if you want to weigh in on where this stands, but these are some of the things currently going on related to this. One was the partnerships that occurred to develop the Adam and Amanda Center in Athens County. Do you want to highlight that at all, Dustin, in terms of its status today?
Sure, yeah. Groundbreaking is going to be happening in the next few months. We are a little bit behind schedule with the groundbreaking. We were planning on doing it in the spring. I think it'll probably happen in the summertime. But that's actually bought us some time to work on getting 80 people supported housing in the Southeast Ohio area. So the idea is people leave the hospital oftentimes too soon when they're not stable, and about 30% end up going to a homeless shelter, and oftentimes there's waiting lists there. So they're just really out on the street or in the countryside. So the Adam Amanda Center would allow them to be there for up to 50 days. There would be dedicated treatment as well as transition planning, and then the transition would be to permanent supportive housing at scattered sites across the state of Ohio. So that's our phase 2. We just got a grant from the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, which was very exciting. One of 2 grant recipients out of 10 applicants. And so we have Sally Lucan as a contracted expert on this. And so we've already started to identify some developers. We might be working to have some scattered sites where we're building on land that's adjacent to supported living facilities for people with people who are aging, and then those facilities property managers would manage the property, and then we would be able to pull down some supportive housing subsidies for the people, as well as work with the community mental health center providers and get Medicaid billable service to support the people in their homes so they don't end up on the street again and having to see CIT officers that really have no place to go.
Right.
So the other piece of that is the work with the state of Ohio to try and get crisis diversion centers. We did ask for $6 million in the state budget. We got about 1.5 for that. So part of what we're doing is trying to talk to the department about maybe some other sources of funding to get that up and running, because oftentimes CIT officers tell us, you know, I can pick this guy up and take him to net care here in maybe Columbus, but then they have to sit there for hours, and then they get behind on their runs. So that's the thing that keeps them from being able to divert them from jails and prisons and into treatment.
Yeah. So, and that's really speaking to goal number 2 there, the state budget inclusion for regional crisis and or detox related centers. And I believe that's being discussed regionally to take a look at where and how and to what capacity those need to be developed. So all things that are moving forward, not always as fast as we like, but they're things that need to be thoughtful as well. To that end, a few of us have gone to a couple different states to visit other crisis centers to find out what some of the possible models or best models might be, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. In a rural community, it might look very different than what it does in our urban communities. And related to that, the Margaret Clark Morgan Foundation is helping us by sponsoring a Crisis Continuum Conference in March, whereby the consultants that are being hired to help us take a look at Ohio's system will be there along with other national and Ohio-based providers to present on the crisis continuum to show what some options might look like to help our communities begin to move forward. The third strategy was to prioritize training for 911 call takers and dispatchers, and that has taken on a nice life. We held 2 training of trainers in Ohio. These are the 2 groups actually that went through the training. this past year, and they represent these counties, and you can see there were 62 participants across 33 counties, and that was a training of trainers. So we didn't just train the dispatchers, we trained folks that could continue that out into the community, because we don't want to hold that responsibility here. We want it really to be sustainable, and that has gone very well. I think at the time before we held that training, there were maybe 14 programs representing around 20 counties that had some dispatch training. They had done it once or twice, but it wasn't ongoing, it wasn't regular, and they were really eager for some type of structure to continue this. And having 33 counties represented at this training was quite a coup. And we've heard reports back that they have implemented dispatcher training in some of the communities, and that some have altered their training according to what they learned in the program. So that strategy is going very well. And then the last one was maintenance, basically. We needed to not divert so much energy to the other core elements that we lost traction on the trajectory that we had in Ohio regarding training officers and continuing to build on that. So this is a graph that Mike makes, and I'm eager to see what 2017 will look like when it's added to this graph. But you can see these past few years when the strategic plan was in place that we have actually kind of climbed a steeper climb in terms of numbers of people trained. So that's showing good outcome as well. So we're really happy about where the strategic plan progress is going. And these are some of the activities that we use to sustain CIT in Ohio. And I think the biggest credit needs to be given to the partnership at the state level and the CIT coordinators around the state who really drive it forward. Peer to peer, they help one another out. They don't ask for anything from one another. They give freely to each other to make sure that programs are promoted and improved over time. And it's a wonderful group to work with. And as a result of them, we follow the core elements. We have a peer review process that we use, and I believe 17 of our programs have gone through it, representing 20 some odd counties. So people are eager to do it well in Ohio. We're really lucky where that's concerned.